The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September 1881, and Franklin Shaw held it in his weathered hands like it might crumble to dust if he gripped too tight. 3 months had passed since he had placed the advertisement in the Boston newspaper. 3 months of wondering if any woman would want to travel halfway across the country to marry a man she had never met. A cattle rancher with more scars than savings and a loneliness that sat heavier on his shoulders than any saddle ever had. The envelope smelled faintly of lavender, and the handwriting was careful and precise, each letter formed with the kind of attention that spoke of education and patience. Franklin stood on the porch of his ranch house outside Wichita, Kansas, watching the prairie grass bend in waves under the autumn wind, and he felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or fear, possibly both. He tore open the envelope with fingers that had roped cattle and mended fences and pulled calves into the world, fingers that suddenly felt too clumsy for such delicate paper. The letter inside was brief but warm, written by a woman named Sarah Fitzgerald who lived in Boston with her aunt and worked in a textile factory. She wrote about the city's gray skies and crowded streets, about her desire for open spaces and honest work, about her willingness to make a life with a good man in the West. She did not mention beauty or romance, only practical things like cooking and keeping house and not being afraid of hard work. At the bottom of the page, she had added one final line in smaller script. I should tell you that I am missing 2 fingers on my left hand from a factory accident. If this changes your mind, I will understand completely. Franklin read that line 3 times, his thumb tracing over the words. He walked back into his house and sat at the kitchen table his father had built 30 years ago, the wood scarred from decades of use. He thought about all the things that could break a person in this world, all the ways bodies could fail or be failed. He had seen men crushed by spooked horses, women worn down by childbirths that came too close together, children taken by fevers that no amount of prayer could cure. 2 missing fingers seemed like such a small thing compared to the courage it took to write that letter, to offer herself to a stranger, despite knowing she might be rejected for something beyond her control. He wrote back that same afternoon, his handwriting nowhere near as neat as hers, telling her that he had all his fingers but was missing part of his left ear from a run-in with a longhorn, and that his face had been burned by the sun until it looked like old leather, and that he was 32 years old and had never been married because he had been too busy building his ranch into something worth having. He told her that 2 missing fingers did not matter one bit, and that if she was still willing, he would send money for the train ticket and meet her at the Wichita station on whatever day she could arrive. He sealed the letter before he could second-guess himself, and rode into town to post it that evening. 4 weeks later, Franklin stood on the platform at the Wichita train station with his hat in his hands, and his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. He had bathed twice that morning, put on his best shirt, and even let Mrs. Chen at the general store trim his hair, though she had laughed at how nervous he was, and told him that any woman willing to travel across the country was not going to care about a haircut. The train pulled in with a great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes, and passengers began to descend, traveling salesmen and families, and a few rough-looking men who might have been drifters or might have been trouble. Franklin scanned each face, looking for a woman traveling alone, and then he saw her. She stood on the bottom step of the passenger car, one hand gripping the rail, and even from 20 feet away, Franklin could see that she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with paint or fancy dresses. She wore a simple blue traveling suit and a small hat pinned to dark brown hair that had been pulled back into a neat bun. Her face was pale from the long journey, her eyes large and uncertain as she looked around the platform. She was younger than he had expected, maybe 25, and she held herself with a kind of careful dignity that made Franklin want to protect her from every harsh wind and cruel word this territory could throw at a person. He walked forward, his boots loud on the wooden platform, and when he was close enough, he said, "Miss Fitzgerald." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were the color of slate before a storm, gray and searching. "Mr. Shaw." "Yes, madam, Franklin Shaw. Welcome to Wichita." He wanted to say more, wanted to tell her she was prettier than any sunset he had ever seen over the prairie, but the words stuck in his throat. She stepped down onto the platform, and he noticed she kept her left hand tucked into the folds of her skirt. "Thank you for meeting me." The journey was long but not unpleasant. "You have luggage." "Just the one trunk. Everything I own fits inside it." She said this without shame, just a simple statement of fact. Franklin gestured to the porter and arranged for the trunk to be loaded onto his wagon. As they walked across the platform toward the street, he was acutely aware of the space between them, the careful distance she maintained. She was a stranger, he reminded himself. She had every right to be cautious. The wagon was waiting where he had left it, tied to a post outside the station. He helped her up onto the bench seat, and when he took her right hand to steady her, he felt the slight tremble in her fingers. Once she was settled, he climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses, a matched pair of chestnuts he had raised from foals, started forward at his command. They rode in silence for several minutes, the town giving way to open prairie. The afternoon sun cast everything in shades of gold and amber, and a hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "Your letters were very kind." "I meant every word. Did you?" She turned to look at him, and there was something searching in her gaze. Men often say things they do not mean when trying to convince a woman of something. Franklin kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I do not know how to be anything but honest, Miss Fitzgerald." Never learned the trick of pretty lies. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sarah, you should call me Sarah since we are to be married." "Sarah." He tested her name on his tongue, like the feel of it, "and you can call me Franklin or Frank if you prefer." "Most people around here call me Frank. Franklin suits you better." She said this with a small smile, the first he had seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. They drove on, and Franklin pointed out landmarks as they passed. The creek where he watered his cattle, the old cottonwood tree that had been struck by lightning 5 years back, and still stood like a charred sentinel, the boundaries of his land that stretched farther than the eye could see in the fading light. Sarah listened and asked questions about the ranch, about the work, about what her days would look like. She did not ask about the wedding, and Franklin appreciated that. They would get to that in time. When the house came into view, Sarah leaned forward slightly, and Franklin tried to see it through her eyes. It was not much, just a simple wood frame structure with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides and a roof he had repaired himself last spring. But it was solid and well built, with glass windows and a stone chimney, and he had spent the last week cleaning it until every surface gleamed. "It is lovely," Sarah said, and she sounded like she meant it. Franklin pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and helped Sarah down. He carried her trunk inside and set it in the bedroom, the only bedroom, and then he cleared his throat awkwardly. "I will sleep in the barn until we are properly married. There is a room above the stable that is comfortable enough." Sarah looked at him with something like surprise. "That is very considerate of you. I would not have you think I expected anything you were not ready to give freely." He felt his face heat and was grateful for the dim light inside the house. She set her small traveling bag on the kitchen table and untied her hat, setting it carefully beside the bag. Then, with a visible breath, she held out her left hand. Franklin looked down and saw what she had kept hidden on the platform. Her ring finger and little finger were missing, the stumps healed over with shiny scar tissue that spoke of old pain and careful medical attention. "I wanted you to see," she said, "before you make any promises you might regret." Franklin reached out and took her left hand in both of his, turning it gently so he could see the scars in the lamplight. The remaining 3 fingers were long and elegant, the nails neatly trimmed. He ran his thumb across her palm, feeling the calluses there from years of factory work, and then he looked up and met her eyes. "Sarah Fitzgerald, there is nothing about you that needs hiding, not from me." Her eyes filled with tears, though she did not let them fall. "The machine caught my glove. It happened so fast. The foreman said I was lucky it did not take my whole hand. What happened after? They dismissed me from the factory, said I could not work the machines anymore with only one good hand. My aunt took me in, but she is old and poor, and I was a burden she could not afford for long." Sarah pulled her hand back and wrapped her arms around herself. "I know what people think when they see this. They think I am careless or cursed." Franklin shook his head. "I think you survived something terrible and you are still standing. That takes strength, or stubbornness. Same thing out here." He gestured to the kitchen. "Are you hungry? I am not much of a cook, but I can manage stew and biscuits." Sarah looked around the kitchen, taking in the cast iron stove, the pump sink, the shelves lined with mismatched dishes. "I can cook, if you do not mind. It would give me something to do with my hands, both of them." She laughed at that, a real laugh that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. "Yes, both of them." They worked together preparing dinner, Franklin showing her where things were kept, and Sarah moving around the kitchen with increasing confidence. She was good with her hands, both of them, and she had clearly learned to compensate for the missing fingers. She told him about Boston while she cooked, about the narrow streets and tall buildings, about the factory where she had worked 12 hours a day breathing lint and oil fumes, about the noise that never stopped even when you went home because there was always someone shouting or a cart rattling by, or a baby crying through thin walls. "I used to dream about silence," she said, stirring the pot of stew. "Real silence where you could hear yourself think. We have plenty of that out here, maybe too much for some people. Not for me." She ladled stew into bowls and set them on the table along with a plate of biscuits that looked far better than anything Franklin had ever managed. They sat across from each other, and Franklin said a brief grace before they ate. The stew was good, rich with carrots and potatoes and chunks of beef. They ate in comfortable quiet, and when they were done, Sarah insisted on washing the dishes. Franklin dried them and put them away, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen like they had been doing this for years instead of hours. When the kitchen was clean, Franklin showed Sarah around the rest of the house. There was not much to see. The bedroom with its large bed and simple dresser, the main room with a fireplace and 2 chairs, a small bathing room he had added just last year with a tin tub and a pump for water. Sarah touched things lightly as they walked, running her fingers over the quilt on the bed, the books on the shelf by the fireplace, the photographs in simple frames. "Who are these people?" she asked, picking up a photograph of a man and woman standing stiffly before a painted backdrop. "My parents. That was taken a year before they died. Fever took them both within a week of each other." Franklin stood beside her, looking at the faces he could barely remember now. "I was 19, inherited the ranch and did not have the first idea how to run it, but you learned. Had to. It was this or starve." He pointed to another photograph, this one of a young boy with serious eyes. "That was me at 10. My mother insisted on the photograph when a traveling photographer came through town." Sarah smiled at the serious child in the picture, then set it carefully back on the shelf. I have no photographs of my family. My mother died when I was born and my father passed when I was 12. There was never money for such things. Your aunt, she did her best, fed me and kept a roof over my head. But she was my mother's sister, and I think I reminded her too much of what she had lost. Sarah turned away from the shelf and hugged herself again, that gesture Franklin was beginning to recognize as her default when she felt vulnerable. I do not mean to sound ungrateful. You do not sound ungrateful. You sound honest. Franklin walked to the door and picked up his hat from the hook. I should let you rest. The bedroom is yours. I put fresh linens on the bed this morning. Thank you, Franklin. She followed him to the door, and when he stepped out onto the porch, she stayed framed in the doorway, the lamplight behind her. Tomorrow, perhaps we could talk about the wedding. Tomorrow, he agreed. Sleep well, Sarah. He walked across the yard to the barn, his boots crunching on the dry grass. The horses nickered at him as he climbed the ladder to the room above the stable, a small space with a cot and a trunk and a single window that looked out over the prairie. He lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds. Crickets singing, cattle lowing in the distance, the whisper of wind through the eaves. He thought about Sarah in his house, sleeping in his bed, and he felt that unfamiliar hope stir again in his chest. The next morning, Franklin woke before dawn as he always did and went about his chores. He fed the horses and mucked out the stalls, checked on the cattle in the near pasture, repaired a section of fence that had come loose. When he returned to the house, the sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and he could smell coffee brewing. Sarah was already up and dressed, her hair pinned back neatly, an apron tied around her waist. She had found the eggs he kept in the cold cellar and was frying them alongside strips of bacon. The table was set for two, and there was fresh bread she must have baked before he woke. "Good morning," she said when he came in. "I hope you do not mind that I made myself at home in your kitchen." "Our kitchen," he corrected gently. "And I do not mind at all. It smells better in here than it has in years." They sat down to breakfast, and Franklin told her about his plans for the day. Riding out to check on the herd, meeting with his ranch hand Miguel about purchasing more feed for the winter, possibly going into town for supplies. Sarah listened and then said, "I would like to go into town with you if that would be all right. I need to meet the preacher about the wedding." "Of course. We can go this afternoon after I finish with Miguel." "When would you like to marry?" she asked, her eyes on her plate. Franklin considered this. "Whenever you are ready, there is no rush." "I am ready now." She looked up at him, her gray eyes steady. "I did not come all this way to wait unless you have doubts." "No doubts." He said it firmly, meaning it. "Today if you want, tomorrow, this week." "This Sunday," Sarah decided. "That gives us time to make arrangements and for me to alter the dress I brought. It is not fancy, but it is white, or close enough." "Sunday it is, then." They finished breakfast, and Sarah insisted on cleaning up while Franklin went to find Miguel. His ranch hand was a man of about 40 with a weathered face and a quick smile. He had been working for Franklin for 5 years and knew the ranch almost as well as Franklin did. When Franklin told him about the wedding, Miguel grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "About time you found yourself a wife. This place needs a woman's touch." "She seems nice enough," Franklin said, trying to sound casual. "Nice enough. You have been grinning like a fool since yesterday. She must be more than nice." Miguel laughed and went back to checking the feed supplies. They spent the next hour going over what they would need for the winter, calculating costs and making lists. That afternoon, Franklin hitched the horses to the wagon again, and Sarah came out wearing the same blue traveling suit from the day before. She had pinned her hat in place and carried a small reticule. They drove into Wichita together, and Franklin found himself pointing out more landmarks, telling her stories about the town and the people who lived there. Sarah asked questions and listened carefully to his answers, and Franklin thought that maybe this could work, this arrangement between two practical people who needed each other. The town was busy when they arrived, full of people going about their Saturday business. Franklin helped Sarah down from the wagon and walked with her to the church, a simple white building at the end of Main Street. Reverend Matthews was tending his small garden when they arrived, and he looked up with a smile when he saw them approaching. "Franklin Shaw, as I live and breathe. I was wondering when you would bring your intended by to see me." The Reverend was a tall man with kind eyes and hair that had gone white before his 50th birthday. He had married Franklin's parents and baptized Franklin as a baby, and he had presided over both their funerals. "Reverend Matthews, this is Sarah Fitzgerald from Boston. We would like to be married this Sunday if you are available." The Reverend wiped his hands on his trousers and shook Sarah's right hand warmly. "Welcome to Wichita, my dear. It is a pleasure to meet you." His eyes were sharp as he looked between them. "This Sunday is quite soon. Is there a particular reason for the hurry?" "No particular reason," Sarah said, her voice calm. "Only that I have come a long way and I see no point in waiting." Reverend Matthews studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Sunday after the morning service, then. Will you have witnesses?" "Miguel and his wife, I expect," Franklin said, "and anyone else who wants to come." "Excellent. I will make the announcement tomorrow during service." The Reverend turned to Sarah. "My dear, would you like some time to speak with me privately? I always offer couples the chance to discuss marriage and what it entails." Sarah glanced at Franklin, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, thank you. I would appreciate that." Franklin waited outside in the garden while Sarah and the Reverend went into the church. He paced among the vegetables, pulling the occasional weed, trying not to think too hard about what they might be discussing. After about 20 minutes, Sarah emerged, her expression peaceful. "Everything all right?" Franklin asked as they walked back toward the wagon. "Yes, he is a good man. He wanted to make sure I was entering this marriage freely and that I understood what life out here would be like." She smiled slightly. "I assured him I was not looking for an easy life." They stopped at the general store next, where Mrs. Chen greeted them with enthusiasm and insisted on showing Sarah all the available fabrics, despite Sarah's protests that she did not need anything new. In the end, Sarah purchased thread and needles and a few other small notions, and Mrs. Chen promised to spread the word about the wedding. As they left the store, Franklin noticed a man watching them from across the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a cruel mouth and eyes that lingered too long on Sarah. Franklin had seen him around town before, a drifter named Jack Hollies, who made his money gambling and occasionally hiring out his gun. Franklin put his hand on Sarah's elbow and steered her toward the wagon. "Who was that man?" Sarah asked when they were driving away. "Nobody worth knowing," Franklin said. "Just stay clear of him if you see him around." They spent the rest of the afternoon driving through Franklin's land, and he showed her the full extent of the ranch. The creek that never ran dry, the pastures where the cattle grazed, the lined shack where he stayed when he needed to watch the herd overnight. Sarah seemed genuinely interested, asking about the cattle and the horses and how he managed everything with just Miguel to help. "It is a lot of work," Franklin admitted, "but it is good work, honest." "I am not afraid of work," Sarah said. "I have been working since I was old enough to thread a needle." That evening, they had dinner together again, and afterward, Sarah brought out the dress she planned to wear for the wedding. It was a simple cream-colored dress with long sleeves and a high neck, practical but pretty. She laid it across the bed and showed Franklin where she planned to take in the waist and add a bit of lace at the collar. "It will be beautiful," Franklin said, meaning it. "It will be adequate." Sarah folded the dress carefully. "I never dreamed of a fancy wedding. This will do." The days before the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Sarah spent her time sewing and cooking and getting to know the house, while Franklin worked the ranch and tried not to be too nervous. Miguel's wife Carmen came by on Friday, a warm woman who spoke heavily accented English and who immediately took Sarah under her wing. The two women spent the afternoon cooking together and talking, and Franklin could hear Sarah's laughter from where he was working in the barn. Saturday evening, Franklin bathed in the creek and put on clean clothes, then went to the barn where Miguel was waiting with a bottle of whiskey he had been saving. "To your last night as a free man," Miguel said, pouring them each a measure. "I am not sure I was ever free," Franklin said. "Just lonely." They drank and talked about marriage and women and the ranch, and Miguel told stories about his own wedding 20 years ago in Mexico, before he had come north looking for work. Finally, when the bottle was half empty and the stars were bright overhead, Miguel clapped Franklin on the shoulder and said, "You are a good man, Franklin Shaw. She is lucky to have you. I think I am the lucky one." Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that made a person grateful to be alive. Franklin dressed in his best suit, a dark wool number he had bought for his father's funeral and had worn perhaps 3 times since. He combed his hair and shaved carefully, nicking himself only once, and then he walked to the house to collect Sarah. She was waiting for him on the porch, and when he saw her, his breath caught. She had worked some kind of magic with that simple dress, and it fit her perfectly now, the lace at the collar framing her face. She had left her hair mostly down, just the sides pinned back, and the morning sun caught the golden highlights in the brown. She held a small bouquet of prairie flowers, and she smiled nervously when she saw him. "You look beautiful," Franklin said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "You look very handsome yourself." Sarah came down the steps and took his offered arm. "Are you ready for this?" "More ready than I have ever been for anything." They drove to town together, and the church was already filling with people when they arrived. Word had spread, as it always did in small towns, and it seemed like half of Wichita had turned out to see Franklin Shaw finally get married. Miguel and Carmen were there, along with Mrs. Chen and the Reverend's wife, and a dozen other people Franklin knew from town. The ceremony was simple and brief. They stood before Reverend Matthews and repeated the vows he gave them, and when it came time for the ring, Franklin produced a simple gold band he had bought from the jeweler the day before. He slipped it onto Sarah's left hand, onto her ring finger that was not there, and so he put it on her middle finger instead. It fit perfectly. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Matthews said with a broad smile. "Franklin, you may kiss your bride." Franklin turned to Sarah, and she looked up at him with those gray eyes, and he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, chaste and brief, but it felt like a promise. When they pulled apart, Sarah was blushing, and Franklin felt like his heart might pound right out of his chest. The congregation applauded, and people came forward to offer congratulations. Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes as she hugged Sarah, and Miguel pumped Franklin's hand enthusiastically. Carmen had prepared food for a small reception in the church hall, and for the next hour, Franklin and Sarah mingled with their guests, accepting good wishes and eating cake and trying to remember everyone's names. Finally, as the afternoon sun began to slant through the church windows, Franklin caught Sarah's eye and nodded toward the door. She understood immediately and made their excuses, and they slipped out to the wagon while people were distracted with the last of the food. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Franklin kept glancing at Sarah, at the ring on her hand and the flowers in her lap, trying to believe that this was real, that she was his wife now. When they reached the house, Franklin helped Sarah down from the wagon and said, "I should tend to the horses." "I will wait for you inside," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that made Franklin's pulse quicken. He took care of the horses as quickly as he could, giving them water and feed and a quick rub-down. When he could not put it off any longer, he walked back to the house. Sarah had lit lamps in the bedroom, and she was standing by the window, still wearing her wedding dress. When she heard him come in, she turned. "Franklin, I need to tell you something." He went to her, concerned by the serious tone of her voice. "What is it?" "I have never been with a man before. I do not know exactly what to expect or what you will expect of me." She was blushing furiously now, her eyes on her hands. "I want to be a good wife to you, but I am afraid I will disappoint you." Franklin took her hands in his, both of them, and waited until she looked up at him. "Sarah, you could never disappoint me. We will figure this out together and there is no rush. We have all the time in the world." "I want to," she said quickly. "I want to be your wife in every way. I am just nervous." "So am I," he admitted, and she laughed, surprised. "You are terrified," he said honestly. "I have never done this either, and I am afraid I will hurt you or do something wrong." They stood there looking at each other, two nervous people who had taken an enormous leap of faith. And then Sarah reached up and touched his face. Her hand was warm against his cheek, and Franklin turned his head and kissed her palm. She shivered at the touch, and he pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. They undressed each other slowly, awkwardly at first, helping with buttons and laces. Franklin was careful with her, watching her face for any sign of discomfort, and Sarah touched him with wonder, tracing the scars on his shoulder from that longhorn, the burn marks on his arms from brandings gone wrong. They learned each other's bodies in the lamplight, and when they finally came together, it was with tenderness and care and a growing passion that surprised them both. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Sarah's head on Franklin's chest, his hand stroking her hair. She traced circles on his skin with her fingers, all 7 of them, and he caught her left hand and kissed the scarred stumps where her fingers used to be. "Perfect," he murmured against her skin. "Every part of you is perfect." Sarah tilted her head up to look at him, and her eyes were shining with tears. "I never thought I would have this. A home, a husband who looks at me like I am whole." "You are whole. You were always whole." He pulled her closer. "I am the one who was broken before you came." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Franklin slept better than he had in years. The weeks that followed were a revelation. Sarah transformed the house, adding small touches that made it feel like a home. Curtains she sewed for the windows, a tablecloth embroidered with flowers, jars of preserves lined up neatly in the pantry. She learned the rhythms of ranch life quickly, rising with Franklin before dawn to make breakfast, packing him lunch when he rode out to check the herd, having dinner ready when he came home at night. But it was more than that. She worked alongside him when he needed help, holding fence posts while he hammered or sorting through the chickens she insisted they needed. She learned to ride, though she was nervous on horseback at first, and Franklin spent hours teaching her, one hand on her waist to steady her. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, and Sarah read to him from books she had brought from Boston, novels and poetry that Franklin would never have picked up on his own, but found he enjoyed when she read them in her clear, expressive voice. They learned each other's rhythms and habits. Franklin discovered that Sarah liked her coffee with cream and sugar, that she hummed when she was concentrating on a task, that she had a sharp wit that surprised him into laughter. Sarah learned that Franklin was an early riser who could not sleep past dawn even on Sundays, that he had a deep love for this land that bordered on reverence, that he was kinder than his rough exterior suggested. They also learned each other's bodies, night after night in the big bed. The awkwardness faded, replaced by confidence and deepening intimacy. Franklin loved the sound Sarah made when he touched her, the way she arched into him, the smile she wore afterward when they lay together in the dark. Sarah loved the solid strength of him, the gentleness of his hands, the way he whispered her name like a prayer. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in late October. Franklin spent long days moving the cattle to sheltered pastures and reinforcing the barn against the cold. Sarah learned to manage the wood stove so it never went out, keeping the house warm even on the coldest nights. They were snowed in for a week in November, and Franklin thought he might go crazy being trapped inside. But Sarah kept him entertained with card games and stories, and the kind of lovemaking that made him forget there was a world outside those four walls. It was during that week that they talked about their pasts, really talked in a way they had not done before. Sarah told him about her childhood, about growing up poor in Boston with a father who drank and an aunt who resented having to take her in. She told him about the factory, about the noise and the danger and the girls who lost fingers or hands or worse to those uncaring machines. She told him about the day of her accident, how she had been working a double shift because she needed the money, how tired she had been, how the glove had caught and pulled her hand into the gears before she could scream. "They gave me a week's pay and told me not to come back," she said, staring into the fire. "Like I was trash they could throw away." Franklin pulled her close, wishing he could go back in time and protect her from all of that. "You are not trash. You are the most valuable thing in my life." Sarah kissed him for that, long and deep, and they did not talk any more that night. Franklin told her about his parents, about growing up on this ranch when it was half the size it was now. He told her about his father's death, about holding his mother's hand while the fever took her too, about being 19 and alone and terrified. He told her about the early years when he did not know if he would make it, when the cattle got sick, or the prices dropped, or the weather turned bad. He told her about Miguel, who had showed up looking for work and had become his closest friend. "I was so lonely," Franklin admitted. "For years I told myself I did not need anyone, that I was fine on my own, but I was lying to myself." "I know that kind of loneliness," Sarah said softly. "I am glad we found each other." "So am I." Christmas came, and Sarah insisted they celebrate even though Franklin had not bothered with such things in years. She made a feast with the last of the fall vegetables and a chicken she had been fattening for weeks. She baked cookies and hung sprigs of pine around the house, and on Christmas morning, she gave Franklin a shirt she had sewn, the stitches so perfect he could barely see them. Franklin gave her a music box he had ordered from a catalog, a delicate thing with painted flowers on the lid. When Sarah opened it, a tinkling melody played and her eyes filled with tears. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "I have never had anything so beautiful." "You deserve beautiful things," Franklin said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. They made love by the light of the Christmas tree they had cut down together, pine-scented and slow, and Franklin thought that he had never been happier in his entire life. The new year came, 1882, dawning cold and bright. Franklin threw himself into planning for the spring, ordering new stock and making repairs to equipment that had worn over the winter. Sarah started a garden, planning what she would plant when the ground thawed, drawing elaborate maps of where the tomatoes and beans and squash would go. It was in late February when Sarah came to him with news that made his heart stop. They were sitting at dinner, and she set down her fork and said, "Franklin, I think I might be with child." He stared at her, his mind going blank. "You think I am late. More than 6 weeks now. And I have been sick in the mornings." She twisted her napkin in her hands. "I could be wrong, but I do not think I am." Franklin got up from his chair and went to her, kneeling beside her and taking her hands. "Are you happy about this?" "I am terrified," Sarah said honestly. "But yes, I am happy." "Are you?" "I am terrified too," he admitted. "And happier than I have words for." They held each other in the kitchen, the dinner growing cold on the table, and Franklin felt the weight of this new responsibility settle on his shoulders. A child, his child, their child. The months that followed were both wonderful and terrifying. Sarah bloomed with pregnancy, her body changing in ways that amazed Franklin. Her belly grew round, and he loved to put his hand there and feel the baby move. She glowed with health despite the morning sickness that plagued her through the first few months, and Franklin had never seen her look more beautiful. But he was also terrified of all the things that could go wrong. He had seen women die in childbirth, had seen babies born too small or too weak to survive. He hovered over Sarah, trying not to smother her but unable to help himself. She tolerated his worry with good humor, assuring him that she was strong and the baby was strong and everything would be fine. Carmen came to stay with them as Sarah's due date approached, and Franklin was grateful for the older woman's presence. She knew about birthing babies, had delivered 6 in her time, and she promised Franklin that she would take good care of Sarah. The baby came in early September, just as the prairie grass was turning gold. Sarah's labor started in the middle of the night, and Franklin rode like hell to fetch Carmen while Miguel stayed with Sarah. By the time Franklin got back to the house, Sarah was in the thick of it, pacing the bedroom and breathing through contractions that made her gasp. Franklin wanted to stay with her, but Carmen shooed him out, saying this was women's work. He paced the main room, listening to Sarah's cries through the door, feeling helpless and terrified. Miguel tried to distract him with conversation, but Franklin could not focus on anything except the sounds coming from that bedroom. It took hours, long hours during which Franklin prayed more fervently than he ever had in his life. He bargained with God, promised anything and everything if Sarah and the baby would just be all right. Finally, just as the sun was rising, he heard a new sound. The thin, wavering cry of a newborn. Carmen opened the door, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son, Franklin, a healthy boy, and Sarah is fine. Tired but fine." Franklin pushed past her into the bedroom. Sarah was propped up in bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle, and Franklin approached slowly, hardly daring to breathe. "Come meet your son," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. Franklin sat on the edge of the bed and looked down at the baby in Sarah's arms. He was tiny and red-faced, with a cap of dark hair and eyes squeezed shut against the light. Franklin reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand, and tiny fingers curled around his, gripping with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Franklin whispered. "He is," Sarah agreed. What should we name him? They had discussed names for months but had never settled on anything. Now, looking at his son, Franklin said, "Samuel, after your father." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Samuel Shaw, I love it." Samuel was a good baby, calm and content to sleep in the cradle Franklin had built. Sarah took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, learning to feed and change and soothe the baby. Franklin helped whenever he could, walking the floor with Samuel at night when he was fussy, singing old songs his mother had sung to him. Life on the ranch took on a new rhythm, shaped around the needs of this tiny person. Franklin found himself rushing through his work so he could get back to the house, so he could hold his son and watch Sarah with him, and marvel at the family they had created. Samuel grew, and as he did, Franklin could see both himself and Sarah in the baby's features. He had Sarah's gray eyes and Franklin's stubborn chin, and he had a sunny disposition that made everyone who met him smile. The years passed, marked by Samuel's milestones. His first word, his first steps, his first time helping Franklin feed the chickens. Sarah got pregnant again when Samuel was 2, and this time she carried a daughter they named Mary after Franklin's mother. Mary was fierier than Samuel, demanding and loud, and Franklin loved her fiercely. The ranch prospered, and Franklin expanded the herd and built a new barn and hired another hand to help Miguel. Sarah's garden produced abundant vegetables every summer, and she learned to preserve them for the winter. The house was always full of noise now, children laughing and crying, Sarah singing while she worked, Franklin's boots on the porch after a long day. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Franklin took Sarah into town and bought her a new dress, a beautiful blue thing with lace at the sleeves. She protested the expense, but he insisted, and when she wore it to church the following Sunday, every head turned to admire her. That night, after the children were asleep, Franklin took Sarah's left hand in his and kissed each finger, including the ones that were not there. 5 years ago, I was the loneliest man in Kansas. Now I have everything I ever dreamed of and more. Sarah smiled at him, the same smile that had transformed her face on that first day when he had picked her up at the station. 5 years ago, I thought I was broken, that no one would want me. You showed me I was wrong. You showed me I was perfect just as I am. You are perfect, Franklin said. Every part of you, every single part. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that had not dimmed in 5 years of marriage. Afterwards, Sarah lay in Franklin's arms and said, "I am pregnant again." Franklin laughed, pure joy bubbling up from his chest. "Again, are you sure?" "Very sure. Carmen says I will have the baby in the spring." "A spring baby," Franklin mused. "That will be nice." This baby was another boy, born in April during a thunderstorm that shook the house. They named him Thomas, and he was the spitting image of Franklin, with brown hair and a serious expression even as an infant. Samuel and Mary were fascinated by their new brother, and Sarah had to constantly watch to make sure they did not love him too enthusiastically. More years passed, and the children grew. Samuel showed an aptitude for working with the cattle, following Franklin around the ranch and asking endless questions. Mary was more interested in her mother's work, learning to cook and sew and tend the garden. Thomas was the dreamer of the family, always wandering off to explore or sitting for hours watching clouds drift across the sky. Franklin taught all 3 of them to ride, and on Sundays, the whole family would go for rides across the prairie. Sarah was an accomplished rider now, fearless and graceful in the saddle. Franklin loved watching her ride, loved the freedom he saw in her face when she let her horse run. When Samuel was 10, he asked his mother about her missing fingers. They were all sitting at dinner, and he said it with the blunt curiosity of a child. "Mama, what happened to your hand?" Sarah looked at Franklin, and he nodded encouragingly. She held up her left hand and said, "When I was younger, I worked in a factory in Boston. There were big machines that made fabric, and one day my hand got caught in one of the machines. It hurt very much, and the doctors had to cut off these 2 fingers. Mary's eyes were wide. "Did you cry?" "Yes, I cried a lot. It was very scary and painful." Thomas reached out and touched her hand gently. "Does it hurt now?" "Not anymore, sweetheart. It healed a long time ago." Samuel looked thoughtful. "Is that why you came to Kansas? Because of the accident?" "Partly," Sarah admitted. "I could not work in the factory anymore, and I did not know what else to do. So I answered your father's advertisement, and I came here, and it was the best decision I ever made." Franklin reached across the table and took her hand, the one with the missing fingers, and squeezed gently. "Best decision I ever made, too, writing that advertisement." The children accepted this explanation easily, as children do, and the subject was dropped. But that night, after the children were in bed, Sarah came to Franklin and said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For never making me feel like there was anything wrong with me. For teaching our children that I am whole, even without those fingers." Franklin pulled her into his arms. "You are whole. You were always whole. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you." "I do," Sarah said softly. "After all these years with you, I finally do." The years continued to pass, and the children grew into young adults. Samuel took over more and more of the ranch work, proving himself capable and reliable. Mary fell in love with a young man from town, a schoolteacher named James, and they married when she was 19. Thomas surprised everyone by announcing he wanted to go to college, to study literature and maybe become a writer. Franklin and Sarah scraped together the money to send him east, and he wrote long letters home describing his classes and the books he was reading. Franklin and Sarah grew older too. Franklin's hair went gray at the temples, and Sarah developed fine lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the prairie sun. But they were happy lines, earned from a life full of laughter and love. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Franklin took Sarah back to the spot where he had first brought her when she arrived in Wichita. They stood looking out over the prairie, watching the grass wave in the wind, and Franklin said, "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Boston, marrying a man you had never met?" Sarah looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Regret it? Franklin, these have been the best 20 years of my life. Every single day with you has been a gift, even the hard days, especially the hard days. Because we got through them together." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "I love you, Franklin Shaw. I loved you when I first met you, though I did not know it yet. I loved you when you took my hand and called it perfect. I loved you when you held our babies for the first time. I love you now, and I will love you until the day I die." Franklin felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I love you too, Sarah, more than I have words to say." They kissed there on the prairie, the wind whipping around them, and Franklin thought about all the years they had shared and all the years still to come. More time passed, and Mary had children of her own, 2 daughters who loved to visit the ranch and learn to ride from their grandfather. Thomas graduated from college and got a job at a newspaper back east, but he came home every Christmas with stories of the city and the people he met. Samuel married a local girl named Anna, and they took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, building a house on the far side of the property. Franklin and Sarah slowed down, as people do with age. Franklin's joints ached in the morning, and Sarah's hair went completely gray, though Franklin thought she was more beautiful than ever. They spent their days in a comfortable routine, tending the garden, taking care of the chickens, sitting on the porch in the evenings, and watching the sun set over the land they had built a life on. One evening, when Franklin was 60 and Sarah was 53, they sat on that porch together, holding hands as they had done thousands of times before. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing. "You remember the day we met?" Sarah asked. "Every detail," Franklin said. "You stepped off that train looking scared and brave all at once. I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I was terrified. I thought you would take one look at my hand and send me back to Boston. I took one look at your hand and knew you were exactly who I had been waiting for." Franklin brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, the same gesture he had made countless times over the years. "This hand, these fingers, they are part of you, and every part of you is perfect." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know, when I was young, I thought the accident had ruined my life. I thought I would never be anything more than a burden, someone to be pitied or avoided. But it brought me here. It brought me to you. I am glad for it then. Glad for everything that brought you to my door." They sat in companionable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the prairie in gold. Franklin thought about all the years they had shared, all the joys and sorrows, all the ordinary moments that had added up to an extraordinary life. He thought about Sarah's courage in coming west, about the leap of faith they had both taken, about the love they had built from practically nothing. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing the question from years before. "Not a single one," Sarah said. "You? Only that I did not find you sooner." Sarah laughed, that same laugh he had fallen in love with all those years ago. "We found each other at exactly the right time, not a moment too soon or too late." Franklin supposed she was right. She usually was. As the years continued, Franklin and Sarah settled into the gentle rhythm of their later years. They became grandparents several times over, Mary having 4 daughters in total, Samuel and Anna producing 3 sons and a daughter. The grandchildren loved visiting the main house, loved hearing their grandmother's stories and learning their grandfather's tricks for handling horses. Sarah taught her granddaughters to sew, showing them how to make stitches so small they were nearly invisible. She never hid her missing fingers from them, and when the children asked about it, she told them the story simply and without shame. Franklin loved watching her with the children, loved seeing the patience and kindness she showed them. Franklin taught his grandsons about the ranch, about reading weather and managing cattle and fixing things that broke. He was slower now, his movements careful and deliberate, but his knowledge was as deep as ever. The boys listened to him with respect, understanding that they were learning from someone who had spent a lifetime mastering this land. Thomas came home for good when Franklin was 65, giving up his job back east to help run the ranch with Samuel. He had never married, content with his books and his writing, and he moved into the house with Franklin and Sarah. The 3 of them made a comfortable household, Thomas cooking elaborate meals while Sarah critiqued his technique, Franklin dozing by the fire with one of Sarah's knitted blankets over his lap. Franklin's health began to decline when he was 68. Nothing dramatic, just the slow wearing down of a body that had worked hard for decades. He tired more easily, needed help with tasks that used to be simple. Sarah tended him with the same determination she had shown in everything else, making sure he took the tonics the doctor prescribed, insisting he rest when he pushed himself too hard. One night, lying in bed with Sarah curled against his side, Franklin said, "I am not ready to leave you." Sarah lifted her head to look at him, her gray eyes still sharp despite her age. "Then do not. Stay with me as long as you can." "I will try," he promised. "God knows I will try." And he did try, fighting for every day, every moment with the woman he loved. Some days were better than others. On good days, he could still walk to the barn, still sit on the porch and watch the prairie grass bend in the wind. On bad days, he stayed in bed, Sarah reading to him from the books they both loved, her voice as soothing as it had been 40 years ago. The family gathered for Christmas when Franklin was 69, all the children and grandchildren filling the house with noise and laughter. Franklin sat in his chair by the fire, a blanket over his knees, and watched his family with a full heart. Mary had her mother's grace and determination. Samuel had his work ethic and his love for the land. Thomas had his dreaming nature and his quiet strength. And all of them had been raised with love, with the knowledge that they were wanted and valued and perfect just as they were. Sarah sat beside him, her hand in his, and she leaned over and whispered, "Look at what we made, Franklin. Look at this beautiful family." "We did good," he whispered back. "We did better than good. We did amazing." Franklin lived to see another spring, another summer. He was there when Anna had her fifth child, another boy they named Franklin after his grandfather. He held the baby in his arms and felt the circle complete, life continuing long after he was gone. He died on a September morning, 41 years after he had first met Sarah at the train station. It was peaceful in his sleep with Sarah beside him. She woke to find him gone, and she kissed his forehead and told him she loved him one last time, even though he could not hear her. The funeral was well attended, people coming from all over to pay their respects to a man who had been a good neighbor, a good father, a good husband. Sarah stood at the graveside, her children on either side of her, and she did not cry. She had cried enough in private. Now, she stood straight and strong, honoring the man who had taught her she was whole. After the funeral, after the guests had left and the children had returned to their own homes, Sarah sat on the porch alone, watching the sun set over the prairie. She held Franklin's hat in her lap, the one he had worn every day for as long as she had known him, and she traced the worn brim with her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for every moment we had." The wind whispered back through the grass, and Sarah could almost hear Franklin's voice in it. "Perfect. Every part of you is perfect." Sarah lived for another 8 years, watched over by her children and grandchildren. She stayed in the house Franklin had built, tended her garden, and told stories about the man she had loved for 41 years. When she finally died, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 71, they buried her next to Franklin, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates of their lives. But the real monument to their love was not the stones. It was the ranch that Samuel and Anna continued to run. It was Mary's daughters, who taught their own children to sew and to be proud of who they were. It was Thomas's books, filled with stories of the West and the people who had built it. It was the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values forward. It was the story of a woman who lost 2 fingers and thought she had lost everything, and a man who held what was left and called it perfect. It was a love story that proved that the best things in life are not perfect by the world's standards, but by the standards of the heart. And on the prairie outside Wichita, Kansas, where the grass still waves in the wind and the sky stretches on forever, that love story lives on.